In this video, we're going to take a look at the initial part of the digestive system, and that's the oral cavity, which provides an intake of food that will travel the very long distance through the alimentary canal. So the oral cavity is a mucosa-lined cavity that serves, as I indicated, the entry point of food into the digestive system and is made up of a number of structures and unique features that provides that support to this cavity. The labial frenulum is a fold essentially that connects the lips to the gums within which the teeth are situated. The two major components of the roof of the mouth, if you will, is the palate. And the first component is referred to simply as the hard palate. And the hard palate is, as the term suggests, is made up of hard tissue or bony tissue. And these are what are referred to as the palatine bones, the processes of the maxilla, which is the upper portion of the facial bones that make that forms the oral cavity. And the hard palate forms a rigid structure for food when a person makes the decision to swallow that food. So the tongue will force food superior against the hard palate where it has nowhere else to go except for moving in a posterior direction towards the towards the posterior part of the oral cavity. The second part of the palate is the soft palate, and as the term suggests, is made up of soft tissue, in this case, skeletal muscle, and this muscle will rise in a superior direction and close off the nasopharynx, which is the continuous hollow cavity from the nasal cavity into the posterior portion where it becomes continuous with the pharynx and the oropharynx. And so this ensures that during swallowing, food will move in a inferior manner that will eventually find its way to the esophagus. And the tongue is secured to the floor of the oral cavity by what's called the lingual frenulum. And if we take a look at these labels here, here we see the superior labial frenulum that connects the lips to the gums. We have the hard palate formed by the processes of the maxilla, and that is connected to the skeletal muscle, which is called the soft palate. Here you see the tongue, and the tongue is connected to the floor of the mouth of the oral cavity through the lingual frenulum, and the inferior labial frenulum in a similar way as we saw here at the very top with the superior labial frenulum. The inferior connects the lips to the gums. An important component of the oral cavity are the salivary glands, and as the term suggests, the salivary glands produces saliva. And with respect to digestive system function, saliva contains proteins that operate as enzymes, and enzymes are proteins that function to speed up chemical reactions. The chemical reaction to be accelerated in the mouth is the chemical breakup of the carbohydrates contained in the food that is consumed. And making these salivary glands exocrine glands as opposed to endocrine glands. Recall that endocrine glands are the glands that produce hormones that are secreted into the cardiovascular system and circulates through the entire body. Exocrine glands will produce compounds and will secrete those compounds not into the cardiovascular system, but exocrine glands will use very small tubes referred to as ducts and will move those secretions into a particular area of the body. and we'll see that here on the right hand side shortly. There are both intrinsic and extrinsic salivary glands. We'll illustrate the extrinsic salivary glands in a moment on the right hand side. But intrinsic salivary glands are embedded within various tissues of the oral cavity, including the tongue, the palate, lips, and the cheeks. What makes these different from the extrinsic salivary glands is that the extrinsic salivary glands exist as independent organs that will carry out and will produce those secretions and will direct those secretions directly into the oral cavity. And the extrinsic glands include the parotid, submandibular, and sublingual glands. And once again, these are connected by ducts. So if we take a look at the right-hand side, here we see the parotid gland located just on the surface, if you will, of the large masseter muscle, and the parotid duct, colored here in green, will move secretions produced by the parotid gland, so saliva, and directly dump that saliva into the into the oral cavity, as opposed to the cardiovascular system. So these secretions do not move into the cardiovascular system. By way of this green tube, will move those secretions directly into the oral cavity. The submandibular gland, located underneath the mandible, in a similar way, it's not quite as clear in the picture, but you can see the green tube here formed that is continuous with the submandibular gland, will produce secretions and move those into the oral cavity, as will the sublingual gland just underneath the tongue, and you can see these very small ducts, these very small tubes that will produce saliva and move it into the oral cavity. In this case, the entry point is underneath the tongue. So moving forward of the oral cavity is the pharynx, and the pharynx is made up of a couple of components here. It's made up of the oropharynx, the connection between the oral cavity and essentially what is the throat, as well as the laryngopharynx. And this serves as the passageways for food as well as air. And this is formed by constrictor muscles or pharyngeal constrictor muscles that will apply pressure, and when that pressure is applied, the food will move in the directions intended by these muscles. So a lot of labels here. I'm just going to highlight two labels here pointing you to the oropharynx as the most posterior region continuous with the oral cavity, and the laryngopharynx, as you can see here, is continuous with the oropharynx, but it will continue and extend and essentially change names and becoming the esophagus. Not pictured here because it's a cutoff in this diagram. As you continue to move more superior, is the nasopharynx, and the nasopharynx gets closed off during swallowing by the soft palate, and as you can see here, the soft palate will rise in the superior direction and prevent that food from moving superior, and so it only has one way to go, and that is to move inferior. And the epiglottis, which is that soft cartilage, will get pressed in an inferior manner and obstruct, basically close off the trachea, so that we move food in the direction it's supposed to go, into the posterior tube called the esophagus. So we do swallow air with that food. What we do not want to do is to move food into the trachea, because that food will serve as an obstruction to air. So once again here, food plus air moves into the esophagus, but the only air is intended to move into the trachea. So this ends our second video on the anatomy of the digestive system.